I thought we would talk a little bit today about something Fred knows quite a bit about too, and he knows many of the people we'll be talking about, which is the process of making decisions in wartime. And I think we really tend to forget, it's easy to forget, even when you're working in an institution like the Pentagon, that the people who are making these decisions are actually all human beings. And they are subject to a lot of the same personal stresses that all of us are in our daily lives, on top of which they have to bear the burden of responsibility for some incredibly difficult, life and death decisions. And I think one of the big takeaways from my 30 years in government is, if I had to do it over and study something that I didn't study enough before I got into government, it would be social psychology and cognitive psychology, and trying to understand a little bit better how those processes work. Just to offer a couple of examples, and I welcome an opportunity to discuss these and others that people may think of from their own experience. Secretary McNamara, by the end of his tenure as Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, had come dangerously close, President Johnson felt, to having a nervous breakdown, and ultimately left office in 1967, became president of the World Bank, and maintained a studied silence about Vietnam for almost 30 years, until he published his memoir about it, in which he delivered himself of a mea culpa, which I know, at least talking to one former Secretary of Defense, who will remain nameless for this purpose, thought was absolutely outrageous, that McNamara in his memoir would recount that he sent people off to fight and die in a war that he had ceased to believe in by 1966. I think that's the kind of thing that's important to remember. In 1967, Yitzhak Rabin essentially had a nervous breakdown in the run-up to the Six-Day War because of the stresses that he was operating under as the chief of staff. So this is not an uncommon thing, and you can be working in this environment and sometimes still be oblivious to it. I was totally unaware while I was working for Secretary Rumsfeld that he was going through a pretty serious family travail with his son, who was suffering from problems of drug abuse and drug addiction. I only discovered this when I read Secretary Rumsfeld's memoir of his time in office. It reminded me of the fact that I and my family were going through something very similar with our oldest son. But I thought that was my sort of private burden, not realizing that the Secretary of Defense, a little bit earlier temporally, but essentially in roughly the same time frame, was going through something very similar. Secretary of Defense Les Aspin, for whom I worked briefly, also suffered through a very painful period of decision-making in Somalia. He was the Secretary of Defense during the Black Hawk Down incident, and was ultimately fired as a result of his inability to provide an adequate briefing to Congress about that, and literally died brokenhearted about a year after that event. This was a job he had hoped. He'd been a whiz kid, one of McNamara's whiz kids as a budget analyst in the Pentagon in the 60s, then had gone to the Congress, had made defense his stock and trade career, become chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, had always aspired to being Secretary of Defense. His tenure was a one-year disaster, and it literally killed him. I've had some experience with what it's like to deal with some of these issues. I know many of you heard Charlie Hill speak here a couple of days ago. Charlie was my boss when I was, well, on more than one occasion, but in particular when he was the first deputy executive secretary and then executive assistant to Secretary George Shultz. And Charlie and his then wife were having dinner with my wife and me in October of 1983. They stayed late. We'd had, nobody was inebriated, but we'd had a little bit to drink. And he left in our home about 11 o'clock. My wife and I went to bed about 1:30. I was awakened with a phone call from the State Department Operations Center to tell us that the Marine barracks in Beirut had been bombed. It ultimately cost over 260 lives of U.S. Marines, and that decision was something that Secretary Shultz had been very deeply involved in, and I was the one who had to wake him up and tell him about that. I know how I felt. I can only imagine how he felt about that. Secretary Gates, of course, is someone who has now written in great detail about this in his memoir, and I asked you to read Eliot Cohen's review of that memoir. I actually commend the memoir to you itself. It is very well worth reading, although it provokes a number of issues which we can talk about. But Secretary Gates came into the office with certainly a deep concern for the servicemen and women in his charge. But as you read the memoir, it's clear that that concern became a lot deeper over time. One of the things he did in connection with that, which Eliot Cohen writes about in his review, was the decision he made to pursue the development and the fielding of the MRAP, the mine-resistant armored personnel carrier. This was a decision that Secretary Gates made. It showed, I think, the difficulty that any secretary has in asserting their control over this very large and unwieldy bureaucracy that you have to manage as Secretary of Defense. He overrode his deputy secretary, who objected to going outside the normal acquisition and procurement rules in order to field the MRAP. It was a $20 billion decision that some of my colleagues at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments have second-guessed, saying this was a terrible mistake. It was a $20 billion investment in a vehicle that was, essentially a single-purpose vehicle for Iraq and Afghanistan, which we'll never use again. We've left lots of these things behind in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we'll be leaving more behind as we retrograde out of Afghanistan. Yet Bob Gates made it, and he made it, I think, for some absolutely right reasons. One was because he felt very keenly that we needed to do everything we could to protect the young men and women who we were sending into harm's way, who were being blown up by improvised explosive devices and penetrating electronically formed charges and explosive penetrated devices. And he did it for another reason, by the way, which he doesn't acknowledge quite as much, but was very real as well, which was he was buying time politically for President Bush's surge strategy to work. The reality was that as we started to surge additional forces, the 5 additional brigades and the aviation brigade that we put into Iraq starting in January of 2007, something that Fred was very deeply involved in, the number of U.S. casualties spiked. It increased because we were in a more intensive phase of combat in trying to defeat the insurgency. The question we had was politically whether the president could sustain the surge in the face of very, very strong congressional opposition, and opposition paradoxically that came from the now President of the United States and the former Secretary of State and perhaps future President of the United States. And we now know, thanks to Secretary Gates' memoir, that both of them actually, though opposing the surge, ultimately concluded it had worked and conceded that their opposition had been driven by politics, not by a strategic assessment. But the MRAP decision, I think, was a very courageous decision. It required an enormous amount of personal effort by the Secretary. He made other decisions that were similar, not quite as dramatic, but the decision to increase the number of Predator orbits over the battle space, something that General Petraeus and General Odierno desperately wanted, equally required an exertion to break the back of bureaucratic opposition inside the Air Force. There are some times, I know the Secretary felt this, I certainly felt this as Undersecretary, that there were a lot of issues that if you didn't just keep your thumb on them all the time, would somehow just dissipate into the bowels of the bureaucracy. I think it also, by the way, explains some of Secretary Rumsfeld's very, very unique management style, and we can come back and talk about that and trying to deal with that kind of a bureaucracy. Another thing that Secretary Gates did, and I think it was driven not just by concern about troops and casualties, but also by his sense of how the war ought to be prosecuted, was to return a sense of accountability to the department by actually firing people who weren't doing their job. Some of this was driven by concern about the troops, because one of the first things he did was fire people involved in some of the scandals that emerged about the care of our wounded warriors at Walter Reed, including the Secretary of the Army. But later, it evolved to doing something that we really had not done as a nation since the Korean War, which was to relieve commanders in the field, not because they had committed a firing offense, but because the Secretary of Defense believed he had another commander who could better prosecute the war and be more successful on the battlefield. And this was, in fact, although the Secretary I don't think would articulate it this way, was a response to concerns articulated by younger soldiers in the field. There was a very well-known article inside the Pentagon by Army Colonel named Paul Yingling, who wrote about the fact that commanders were failing in Iraq in doing their job and were not being held to account and were not being relieved of command and replaced by commanders. Not only that, they were in some cases suppressing junior officers who were trying to more creatively, on the fly, deal with the problems presented by a counterinsurgency struggle that more senior officials were not recognizing. And so there was a lot roiling around inside the Army at the time that Secretary Gates relieved General McKiernan of command and replaced him with Stanley McChrystal in the spring of 2009. And I think that was a very, again, a very courageous decision, well carried out. This is a long-standing, historical problem. We were not the first ones to encounter some of these difficulties. But it does precipitate, I think, a question in my mind, which is, it's a virtue to be concerned about the safety and security of the men and women in your charge. No one, I think, would deny that. But Professor Cohen raises the question of, at what point does that become debilitating? Because the profession of arms is, by its nature, a dangerous profession. At least in the United States, where we have an all-volunteer force, everybody who is deployed is a volunteer. They understand they are running enormous risks, including the risk that they may lose their life. At what point does concern about, and no one's suggesting that anybody should be cavalier about throwing people into harm's way. And my experience, by the way, is that nobody is. I think that was true of President Clinton, President Bush, both President Bushes. All of them, I think, have been very, very concerned about putting people in harm's way. And the notion that somehow, if things go wrong, that people weren't concerned about it, I think is just flat wrong. But at what point does that concern become debilitating? At what point does it prevent you from successfully carrying out military operations and war? President Lincoln very famously had to search for a general who would execute his strategic conception of the war, which was to destroy the Confederate armies. He had, on two occasions, a commander of the Army of the Potomac, General George McClellan, who was very beloved by the troops, who was very good at training and at preparing the troops for battle, but very, very shy about actually throwing them into the breach. He had what Lincoln called a very bad case of the slows when it came to getting troops into battle, and he once asked McClellan if he could actually borrow the army that McClellan was commanding but not using to fight. And ultimately he did find a general in Ulysses S. Grant who was prepared in the spring of 1864 to carry out his strategic conception, which led to the Overland Campaign in Virginia. I live in Stafford County, which is right in the middle of all that territory, but it was a grinding, brutal campaign which cost an enormous amount, number of lives on both sides. And some people have said this is the American way of war, that you just throw brute force at it. We can debate whether that's an accurate description of the American way of war. Fred, as a military historian, may have a view on that. But no one is suggesting that that's what one has to do, that just throw lives into the breach without really much concern for casualties, although I think Grant was also pretty concerned about the casualties. I don't think, if you read his memoirs, there's no doubt that he understood what he was asking of the men under his command. But I do think it's an important question about when and how this becomes disabling, and when it becomes an impediment to making the decisions, life and death decisions, that are necessary in war in order to secure, our aims.
It's remarkable. Not only do people tend not to understand the psychology of being a decision maker, they usually don't understand the banality of it either. And I had an opportunity to observe this in the time that I spent in Afghanistan as a pseudo staff officer for Dave Petraeus and John Allen. And I think, can you just to describe what does a day in the life of the Secretary of Defense actually look like?
Yeah, I think, that is one of the underappreciated factors here. I think it's always been true. I think since 9/11 it became particularly true. Secretary Gates observed that, one of the things that he had been, of course, Director of Central Intelligence when he left government in 1993, and he observed that one of the things that was different about government when he returned in 2006, 13 years later, was that the velocity of events had really increased a lot, that the range of subjects about which a Secretary of Defense had to be conversant and had to opine about inside the government in terms of decision-making. You could go from Iraq to Afghanistan to North Korea to conflict diamonds in Africa and have meetings on every one of those subjects in one day, and somehow have to wrap your mind around the details of each one of those things as you were trying to deal with them. And this is all part of an extremely long day, some of which is very routine, but a lot of which is not, and it's tiring and it's exhausting. We expect our Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense now to travel. In fact, some of them have made a fetish of how many miles they put on, which I don't think is actually the right metric for success, but unfortunately we seem to be stuck with it. But it's very exhausting, and it's very wearing, and it at some level can't help but over time start to impede your ability to process information and to make decisions. I know I, for one, by 7 o'clock in the evening, I had been at that point up since usually 4:30 in the morning, and had been working pretty much straight since 6 o'clock in the morning. I found it almost every decision I made that I regretted later was made after 7 o'clock at night. And I got to the point where I wouldn't make decisions after 7 o'clock unless I absolutely have to, because I didn't want to be doing it when I was fatigued.
This, the question of the multiple roles that these guys have to play, I think, is very important. It goes to the question of how they take in information and how information is presented to them. Can you give any sort of estimate about how much time, roughly, Secretary Gates spent, or Secretary Rumsfeld, for that matter, spent, sort of thinking about the surge decision or being briefed about the surge decision?
Well, the surge decision took place.
It was awkward because it was kind of an interregnum. So.
Yeah, it was a very awkward situation in the sense that the sequence of events was although, as you know, discussions internally in various quarters had begun about the possibility of having some kind of surge or increase in the number of troops had begun among members of the NSC staff like Megan O'Sullivan and J.D. Crouch, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and Steve Hadley, the National Security Advisor. They were having conversations with me. General Odierno, who had been tapped to go out to be the Corps commander for the multinational Corps in Iraq, was at Fort Hood. He was beginning some studies about what might be necessary. They were coming to a similar kind of conclusion. And he and I spoke privately in November before he went out about it. You and Jack Keane, of course, were doing the work that you did at AEI, which was incredibly important to this whole process. So there was a lot of ferment going on, but you had the congressional election in which the Republicans lost control of the Senate and the House. You had a couple of days later, or a week later, essentially, the resignation of, or actually it was, I guess, the day of the election. You had the resignation of Secretary Rumsfeld and the nomination of Secretary Gates. But Secretary Gates, for his own good and sufficient reasons, who was president of Texas A&M University, wanted to finish the term, which ended on December 15th, I think, was when graduation at A&M was.
Can you speak up?
He was not sworn in until December 16th. So we had a month and a half period where we had the outgoing Secretary of Defense still in command, and the incoming Secretary of Defense getting briefed up, and it was really sort of awkward. We also had at precisely that same time the interagency review going on, which was a very intensive, twice-a-day process, sort of at least 4 or 5 hours of meetings a day for several weeks that led up to the decisions that led to the surge. And I remember a meeting in the tank, which is the secure conference room of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where President Bush came over with Vice President Cheney to meet with the chairman, the vice, and the service chiefs. And we had both the outgoing Secretary of Defense and the incoming Secretary of Defense, both of whom were silent during the meeting because of the awkwardness of the situation.
And how long was that meeting? About?
Oh, that's a couple of hours.
A couple of hours.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the thing that's always struck me about this. In my in my engagements, it was a huge big deal when we had the opportunity to go in and brief Steve Hadley, and that meeting lasted for an hour and a quarter, which was a very long time for such a meeting. We were presenting to him and some of his folks, including Megan, and I think Brett McGurk was there, and actually remarkably, the Chief of Staff, Bush's Chief of Staff, stuck his head in.
Josh
Bolton, actually, which was very unusual. He came.
Right.
He was there for about 45 minutes, and this was, that they would spend an hour and a quarter with us listening to us brief the results of a 96 hours worth of planning exercise was remarkable. And I've watched, General Petraeus and General Allen also take in 90-minute, 60, 30, 60, 90-minute bits, presentations of incredibly complicated, long discussion and have to make decisions on that basis. And so the part of the challenge, and that sandwiched between, in the ISAF side, meeting with the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, meeting with Karzai, and then, meeting with a congressional delegation that wanted to talk about how, whatever it was they wanted to talk about was almost invariably not relevant to what the war was actually going on, and a bunch of other things. Do photo ops with people. And just, can you talk a little bit about the challenge of comprehending a problem in that way?
So, when I was Assistant Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, when Fred was my intern, it was, in the period of time when we were both fighting the Gulf War and the Soviet Union was collapsing. And I remember going into the then Undersecretary's office, Paul Wolfowitz, sometimes frequently at 8 o'clock at night, and as I would be leaving, my colleagues from the Near East, Fred Smith and some of the others from the Near East, South Asia office, Art Hughes, all these guys would be trooping in to talk to Paul about the Gulf War. And as I would walk out to my car in the Pentagon parking lot, I would look up at Paul's office and see the light still burning, and it would be 9:30 at night, and I thought to myself, God, what an impossible job, And then when I remember thinking back on that after Secretary Rumsfeld offered me the job and I had accepted it, and thinking to myself, oh my God, what have I just done? I've just accepted this impossible job. And, at each higher level you go, the degree of difficulty gets greater. I mean, I felt sorry for myself because I had to worry about all the U.S. bilateral defense relationships and arms control and counterterrorism and counter-narcotics and defense trade controls and all the various other issues that fell into my nuclear weapons, as we discussed last night. All these issues fell into my ambit, and I thought, oh, woe is me, I've got, all this stuff I've got to do. And then I would go in and see the secretary, and he'd, on top of that, he'd have to deal with the tanker lease issue and, with all the procurement problems and MRAP and everything else. I mean, so at each level, the pain quotient, of what you had to do to just get through your day was even higher. So, these are very, very difficult jobs, and, it's one reason why I'm inclined to, even as I'm being critical of the current occupants, to cut them a little bit of slack, because I realize that they are dealing with the same intractable problems and time pressures that we were.
I think that what I'd highlight for any of those of you in this room who are actually subordinates to other people, Eric's point about needing to understand how your superiors best take in information is one of the most important life skills or career skills that you can ever imbibe. And it is amazing how rarely you actually find people who really think that through, including decision makers, because some considerable part of the time, people don't really understand how they take information in best. And a lot of these guys are not necessarily very self-reflective or very self-thoughtful. Self-reflection does not necessarily correlate with advance to senior rank. It can, but I would say that's fairly unusual. And so, watching multiple, I'm sure you had this experience also, watching multiple superiors go through different processes. If you would watch Ray Odierno take a PowerPoint brief in a morning update, and watch Dave Petraeus take a briefing in a morning update, and then watch John Allen take a briefing in a morning update. It was fascinating differences. Odierno was an engineer, and so if you put something up that had a lot of text and stuff, his eyes glazed over, immediately hated that. Didn't like to read. If you put up some complicated picture or stuff, he would kind of work his way through it. If you put up basically an Excel spreadsheet of arbitrary complexity, he would say, hey, okay, row D365, that's different from what it was yesterday. What's going on? And Kim watched him do this a couple of times. And so his staff got used to sort of being able to, okay, well, I guess we need to A, put it in that form, and B, have an answer for every single entry, right? Petraeus every morning, you saw this, I'm sure, would get a morning update, and they would put up a slide that showed the entire Iraqi electrical grid. You remember that? And it was this incredibly complicated visual slide that showed every single tower and all of the lines. So this is the 40 kilovolt line, and this is the 100 kilovolt line, and all this kind of stuff, and their status. And it put up this spaghetti diagram, and everyone, and it was 7:30 in the morning or whatever, so everyone is kind of peering over their coffee going like this. And Dave would say, hey, that 40 kilovolt line to Taji, that's been down for 3 days now. What's going on? Tower 66, I thought they were supposed to get that fixed 2 weeks ago. That's how he took information in. If you wanted John Allen to take information, you wrote it. John loves to read. And if you didn't understand those things and you came in and you presented the same information in the wrong way to any one of these guys, you were likely to have a very negative interaction. And they were not going to understand it, and then you were going to get some bad decisions made. So, I mean, it's just a super important insight. And then just having the insight into what their day looks like. So, I don't know if you had this, probably you did. We had the advantage in ISAF that the commander's calendar was made available to all ISAF personnel. So you could look at his calendar and see what else he was doing that day and what he was doing before and after your meeting.
Right.
If you were bright, you thought about that.
There's another side to this, though, Fred, when you talk about how people take in information, you can also abuse it if you're not careful.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things we discovered, I discovered early on about Secretary Gates was he was very much, as you described John Allen. Secretary Gates liked to read prose. And and he would read a lot. I mean, I used to joke that if you put a cereal box in front of him, he would be reading all the ingredients and everything on the back. And so I came back and told the staff, the Secretary is open to reading at greater length than Secretary Rumsfeld was. But there was a big danger, because when you start, you can open that gate and the bureaucracy says, great, now I don't have to be very disciplined about how much I write anymore. I can just write, and we have this saying in the Foreign Service, if I'd had more time, I would have written it shorter. So you really, I think, have to be careful not to abuse that. The same thing is true of PowerPoint. You find out that, the boss likes PowerPoint, and the next thing you know, you've got PowerPoint decks that are 150 slides long. You have to not abuse it. You have to use it appropriately.
Absolutely. We would discover, Stan McChrystal famously ate one large meal a day. Now, he grazed all the rest of the day. I mean, there's this mythology that he only ate once a day. He was eating continuously, but he only sat down and ate one meal a day, which is, by the way, a terrible idea. But it meant that if you got the 17:30 meeting slot with him, you'd usually walk into his schedule and say, what'd I ever do to you? That was the worst time you ever wanted to meet with Stan McChrystal, because all he was sitting there was thinking about was how hungry he was. So a couple of other approaches to that I observed. One was my one and only substantive meeting with President Bush, which was in June of 2006, along with Elliot Cohen and Robert Kaplan and Mike Vickers. And this was, I think, an initiative from the National Security Staff, and I think Megan O'Sullivan and Brett and I guess Steve probably drove the president, or persuaded the president, that he needed to spend 2 full days thinking about Iraq, which was amazing. And so they set up a conclave at Camp David, and not only did they persuade him to spend his time doing that, but they insisted on bringing in outsiders, including an outsider like me, whom Rumsfeld actively did not want participating in that discussion, because it was their way of trying to get an idea before the president and trying to break through this. So I think it was an effort by subordinates. It was a very praiseworthy effort by subordinates to help deal with that, help the president deal with that problem, and get real information to him, get alternative views to him in a circumstance where there was a lot of groupthink and there was a lot of resistance to that kind of thing. The most poignant moment of that exercise came after we were done, when the president actually was sort of milling around with us afterwards. And he asked exactly that question. how do I find out what's really going on? And it was really remarkable to be, he was asking it of Elliot, I was just sort of in the blast radius, but it was remarkable to hear someone in that position almost plaintively asking that question, because it was apparent to him that he was not understanding what was going on, that he was not getting the real deal. But he didn't know how to get it. And he was really asking for advice, and we really didn't have anything to offer him. Because it's a very personal, it really has to do with your own personality and the interpersonal dynamics of the people who are working for you. And so what was also remarkable to me was the way that our military commanders, the better of them, have dealt with this. And so this is how Kim and I got to spend 15 months in Afghanistan for Dave Petraeus and John Allen. But other civilians have done that too, occasionally officers for other commanders. General Rodriguez had Catherine Dale with him. Ray Odierno famously had Emma Skye with him. And those civilians did a couple of things. One is we argued with the boss. And the rows between Emma and Odierno were famously audible throughout the palace, because Odierno, for anyone who hasn't seen him, is about 6'8", and not by nature soft-spoken. Emma is not a small woman, but she looks tiny compared to Odierno, and she would just scream at him in his office, and he would scream back at her, and everybody knew that's the way that was normal, and he wanted that, because she would tell him, "You're being an idiot, this is stupid, what's the matter with you?" We didn't ever scream at Petraeus. That wasn't the kind of relationship that we had, but he called us directed telescopes, hearkening back to the concept that I think it was B.H. Liddell Hart coined, or was it Crefeld? I don't remember which one. About sending trusted advisors out into the field to get a sense when the boss isn't around, and then come back and report. And so we spent a fair amount of our time doing that, and we and others. And we would go down to units, and the unit commanders, all they would know is that the boss's team said, "You need to see these guys and brief them, tell them what you're doing," and all like that. And so it's some very awkward moments where people would be like, "Who the hell are you? What? What? And we just say, "Don't worry about it. We just tell us what you're doing." And we go back and tell the boss, give the boss an alternate view. And then he could choose whether to dig into it or not. It's a very personality-based thing, but you have to find a way, the leader has to find a way within the constraints of his own personality and the personalities and personal dynamics of the people around him, how to go around the people around him without having them feel, too badly threatened by that or too badly undermined by that. And I think it's a fine art.
Doesn't always work.
No.
So I'll give you one example
Yeah.
of which you're aware, and I think you'll agree it didn't work too well, which was when, at the time Dave was appointed to be CG in Iraq, Secretary Gates also appointed Admiral Fallon to be the CENTCOM commander. Admiral Fallon decided he was going to do just what you suggested, and he took Admiral Sandy Winnefeld, now the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, before that the J5, my counterpart when I was Undersecretary at the tail end of my time in government, and sent Sandy out to sort of find out what was really going on in Iraq. And it had the unfortunate aura of a Navy admiral sending another Navy admiral to grade the homework of an Army general fighting a land war. And the dynamic wasn't very good.
Were you there for the lightsaber briefing?
No.
That was another one that didn't work very well, when Admiral Fallon actually went out and was interacting with Petraeus and Odierno and arguing with them about what was going on in Iraq. And he pulled out a laser pointer and started sort of pointing around. And then Dave pulled out a laser pointer and started pointing. And Ray pulled out a laser pointer and started pointing around. And so all kind of stuff didn't work very well. What I would say to that problem is whatever the atmosphere of that, doing it with a military officer within a military chain is very hard.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why usually when this works, you see civilians doing it, because you don't have that same sense of a military officer has an understandable position in the hierarchy, and when he's doing that kind of thing, it's odd. When a civilian does it, there's much more sort of deniability.
But although my other observation, Fred, I'm interested in your reaction to this, is I came to see the 3 and 4 stars as a kind of, in a way, forming a kind of malign brotherhood that was, I used to joke with Elliot, because he is a actual member of the Magicians Union, as the Magicians Union, which nobody talks about this, the secrets behind the tricks. And it is very hard to get, and this goes back to Gates' accountability, McChrystal, McKiernan being relieved, because I don't think we've had a really thorough, and I know in the UK this is keenly felt in the military too, we haven't had a really honest post-mortem about the military's performance in Iraq and Afghanistan. It'll probably be a little bit before we get one, but I mean, there's been a lot of post-mortem about the failings of us civilians, fair enough. I think we actually need to do that on the military side too. There's been a tendency to exempt the military from that. I think we really need that.
I agree, but President Bush made that almost impossible by appointing General Casey Chief of Staff of the Army.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that was, in my opinion, an enormous mistake. And it made it so that you could not even have an honest discussion within the Army, recognizing that the Army had been failing, because the chief was the guy who had been losing the war. And it was Westmoreland all over again.
It was exactly, I was just going to make the point that
yeah.
it's exactly what Johnson did with
Yeah.
Westmoreland when he made him Chief of Staff, when Creighton Abrams became the commanding general in Vietnam.
And I think Bush's motives were pure. I can understand where he was coming from, but that put a big chilling effect on all of this stuff. I want to follow up on that and ask you if we're making a mistake by imagining that this is a State Department function at all. And the case that I would make is, to begin with, the State Department is a diplomatic corps. That is what its core mission is, and we need a diplomatic corps. And it has to do that excellently, and the Foreign Service has to support that fundamentally. But that's completely different from what we're talking about, which is support, to internal affairs of other states. And going back to USAID, and why is USAID part of state to begin with? Because it was originally conceived as an element of public diplomacy. But it wasn't that in Vietnam, but then it became that once again. And so my question is whether the problem isn't in our fundamental conception of who should be doing this.
Fred, that's a really good point. I mean, and Neil Ferguson actually has suggested that what we really need is a colonial service, and in a certain sense he's right. Of course, it's impossible. I mean, only a Brit could think that the United States could conceivably agree to have a colonial service. Forgot a minor event that took place in the 18th century. Has a somewhat formative
where the colonial service was extremely effective.
So, but his larger point is right, which is, I mean, I don't mean to be critical because I'm an enormous admirer of his scholarship. He's right, and it's I think essentially saying the same thing you're saying. We probably need to reconceptualize AID. Although I would say I would like to go back to the way it was kind of just before I came into the Foreign Service. It started to change when I came in. But in the 60s and 70s, it was quite common for Foreign Service officers to do a tour in AID as part of their rotational experience. And I think that would be a healthy thing. I take your point, and it's a little bit the same point I was making, which is we had not recruited a Foreign Service that was equipped to do what we started to ask people to do when we were sending them out to PRTs in Afghanistan and Iraq and do development work. I mean, most of us in the Foreign Service had no clue what the hell we were doing.
Now, that having been said, I mean, we both had the experience of meeting amazing people, amazing Foreign Service officers who were put into this
Todd Greentree, Carter Malkasian.
Oh my God. I mean, they were really, really incredible people who stepped up, figured it out, and made it happen, built teams, worked with the military, worked with the locals in a really intelligent way. So I don't think we want to give the impression that this was just screwed up from top to bottom. It was just a lot harder than it should have been and a lot less effective than it could have been.
And it was again very idiosyncratic.
Yeah.
There were people like Todd who had actually studied and written about counterinsurgency and knew what the hell they were doing.
Right. So I think I need to ask you a question. We haven't talked about. No, it's not that question. It's not that question either. Do you think it's a problem that Gates published the memoir now?
So it's an interesting question. And of course, Eliot addresses it in his review in the Weekly Standard of Gates's book. I have a preference, and I think that preference may be very, very tainted by the fact that I was actively involved in the Romney campaign and trying to, replace President Obama in office in 2012. Eliot sort of suggests in his review that that Secretary Gates, a lot of what's in the memoir is very, very damning about the Obama administration. Although Secretary Gates is at great pains to spare the president some of that criticism, but no matter what, it's very hard to read it without reading it as very, very damning about a lot of the principles in the national security architecture, and in the end of the day, who's responsible for that? It all ends up, back on the president's desk. So Eliot's view is, well, there are two ways to think about this. One is he owed it to the president whom he served in good faith to wait until the end of the term before he published this. Or if he really strongly felt about this, he should have published before the election so that the electorate had the benefit of his concerns, before them. Now, Secretary Gates as much as endorsed President Obama during the campaign, so he obviously wasn't going to do that. I'm very sympathetic to Eliot's view. However, I do cut Secretary Gates a little bit of slack in the following sense. It used to be that people would not publish their memoirs until years and years after the event. So when you think about Dean Acheson's memoirs, President at the Creation, he published those in, I think, around 1970, which was almost 20 years after he had left office. Robert Murphy, who's a Foreign Service officer who I think is unjustly reviled, but wrote a great memoir, Diplomat Among Warriors, which I've found many occasions to reread since I found myself as a diplomat among warriors for much of my career. Published his memoirs in 1964, about a decade after he had left office. But increasingly, that's not how we do this. Increasingly, there is this pressure for instant gratification and publishing as soon as possible. Part of that, quite honestly, is driven by the financial rewards of publishing very quickly. But it's hard for me to see why Secretary Gates should be taken to task for this when Secretary Clinton has just published her memoirs. So what's the difference between, of course, her excuse is she's running potentially for president if she decides to do it. So you could see it as not really a memoir but a campaign book. But I don't,
What about Tenet?
I don't, in moral terms. Well, and Tenet published while while President Bush was still in office, as did any number of other people.
Right.
Scott McClellan and all sorts of people were publishing their memoirs during the Bush years while Bush was still in office. My predecessor, Doug Feith, published his while Bush was still in office. So I think sort of the niceties of a more genteel age, unfortunately, have passed us by, and so I don't really criticize Secretary Gates too much for his decision to publish.
Eric, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'm very informative for our crew, and real pleasure for me to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you for joining us.
Believe me, Fred, the pleasure was all mine.